Well, hi everybody. On this warm June evening, the second day of summer, and hope everything's going well for you. It seems like this pandemic's been going on for years and not just months at this point. Anyway, as Tony mentioned, I'm the youth culture specialist with Youth Unlimited. I had the pleasure of speaking down there with Tony's group a couple of years ago. Great part of the country. I was looking around for the picture of my family to hold up. I have four grown sons, four wonderful daughters-in-law, five grandsons, and a granddaughter. So that's been my street cred, is raising those kids and now helping out raising the grandchildren. And next week we'll be able to actually hug a couple of them, which is pretty exciting. So thanks for being here tonight. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I had an email from a lady who had been to one of my seminars, one of the live seminars, and she sent me this email and she said, "Hello, Paul, I've contacted you in the past about our two daughters who are 15 and 18 and they go to a Christian school and they're doing great in school. But ever since the pandemic has started, all they do is spend their time online." And she said, "I just don't know what to do." And then she said this, "I'm doing the best I can, but it feels hopeless." And I think there's maybe at least one listening or watching tonight that might identify with that whole thing, that it just seems like there's no way out of this. Well, the good news is with God in control, all things are possible, and we will get through this together. But it's really tough, especially if you've got younger children. Uh, Probably 15 years ago, I put this psalm in just about every youth culture presentation that I have as a little reminder to us. And if you happen to be a follower of Christ, then this will make sense. And if you're not, then hang in there with us. But Psalm 11, verse 3, it says, "If the foundations of a godly society are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" And certainly that question has been asked for 2,000 years, but it really seems relevant today with the pandemic, all the stuff that's going on in our culture, that it's very much a different time. And it's almost like, the walls of morality and righteousness are falling down. And so the psalmist asks, what can the righteous do? We are God's righteous. What can we do? And the answer isn't, host a John Maxwell conference or call your senior pastor or call the head of YU in Northumberland. But the answer is simply this: the Lord is in his holy temple, the Lord's throne is in heaven. And that's the good news tonight, that regardless of how things look, God is still in control. None of this is a surprise to him. And he's hanging in there with us and walking with us on this. So tonight I want to look at 7 reasons why we should be encouraged, or 7 words of encouragement for all of us. And then I want to look at 15 very practical things that we can do. I'll spend, no more than a couple of minutes on each of those. And that'll take us 45 minutes. And then, as Tony mentioned, if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat room and Tony will gather them up as we go, or you can wait till the end and do it in person. So that's where we're at. Anyway, let me give you reasons to be encouraged. I mean, we've got tons of reasons why we can be discouraged, but let's look at some of the positive stuff. Number 1, don't beat yourself up. You've never been through a pandemic. Our kids have never been through a pandemic. I mean, the world really hasn't had a pandemic in over 100 years. And this is new territory for all of us. So if you're wrestling with, making things work within your family household, don't get too bent out of shape over it. Number 2, create structures and routines that bring a rhythm to your family life, and try and stay in those rhythms. And all of us have a rhythm. We had a rhythm to life before the pandemic started. Most of us probably lost that rhythm somewhere along the line, but we need to return to that, because a sense of routine brings a sense of calming. We kind of know where it's going. So for my wife and myself, we try and go down to Lake Ontario. I live in Oakville, and we try and go down to the water and have a walk every day. We do some exercises, and we just stay in that routine. Even this morning at 9 o'clock, we were down at the waterfront for our morning walk. So it's important, and that brings structure and calming to your kids as well. Number three, quality matters more than quantity. And what I mean by that is that if your kids are doing educational things online, maybe they're doing research for school, maybe they're researching just a topic of interest that they've never had time to do before. They're watching documentaries. I have a Scottish background, so I've watched a number of historical documentaries on Scotland. That's quality hours, discovery hours. So those types of hours where kids are learning and engaging and thinking are different than online video gaming hours and social media hours. And so it's all about the quality as we get through this thing. And there's just tons of quality stuff out there online based on your kids' interests. Watch media together. My wife keeps saying it's going to be interesting to see how the world has changed after all of this. And one of the things we know that families are having a lot of time together. I know my four sons and the 6 grandkids between the 3 of those ones, that they have some tough days, but they just love being together. I think there's going to be a lot of parents who don't want to go back to work and leave their family, and I think there's going to be a lot of parents who can hardly wait to get out of the house and get back to work. So that will be part of it as well. So anytime you can sit with your kids, watch a movie, ask some good questions afterwards, have some fun together is a great thing. Schedule both online and offline times. So having that daily schedule, bringing a balance of activities, and getting your kids outdoors. So a balance of screen time versus outdoor time, and getting fresh air and exercise is a great thing. And we can all create those kinds of schedules. And some people even post them on the refrigerator just as a reminder. Number 6, remember it's hard to be a teen these days. And I say this for any teens who might be watching. If you're parents of a teen, this is especially hard for them because so much of their self-identity formation is based on what they do with their groups and their group identity. And somehow, Zooming many hours a day or Skyping just isn't the same thing as being in person. And I'm just old enough that I really hate screens, generally speaking. Happy to be on the screen tonight, but I'm old school. Whenever I have a meeting with my YU friends in Toronto, I go and meet them in a restaurant. I don't do the Skype thing. But this is a tough time for the teens, especially relationally and emotionally and physically. And the only comparison I could think of is that when I was 16 and got my driver's license, what would have happened if my dad said, no, you can't have the car and you can't visit your friends? I mean, that's as close as I could get in the pre-internet days as to having your life shut down. But it's tough on them. So just my plea on behalf of your teens is just to be understanding. And at least now things are starting to open up so they can get a little bit more of that time with their friends. And the last one, don't feel guilty if you're turning to screens, meaning you, the parents, that, there's only so many ways to keep ourselves busy. Some of us might spend more time on screens doing whatever. I had a person email me last week, wanted to talk about how many hours per day they were spending on Facebook, and was that a good use of time, and so forth and so on. And I said, don't feel guilty about it. And the reason we don't need to feel guilty about it is because God understands where we're at. Isaiah 49 says that God holds us in the palm of his hand. In fact, Isaiah 49 says that he has carved our images out on the palms of his hands. That's how precious we are to God. So as we're going through this stuff, he understands. He keeps an eye on us. And we need to be encouraged by that. And that's one of the joys of living your life with a biblical worldview. So there's our 7 reasons to be encouraged. I think there's probably more. We should be encouraged that our province is finally starting to open up, and life will eventually return to normal. And Tony and I were talking beforehand about, going to work and not going to work and what it's like. I think people are hungering just to be in community again and being with people. So my forecast is that a lot of this stuff in terms of businesses will bounce back fairly quickly. All right, 15 practical things we can do. Fasten your seatbelt, hold on to your hat, and we will go through these maybe a couple at a time, a couple of minutes at a time. Number one, encourage time in nature and outdoor play. Our kids have more. The weather's great. Kids are spending time outside, and the reason that's important is the time for the brain to relax. That's why we get outdoors without our iPads and without our phones, to give the brain a rest. I have two grandkids that live in Mississauga. They're brothers. They go over to the park. The oldest one has taught the younger one how to fly kites, how to golf, how to throw a football, and they just love being outside. And my son is a free range parent who gives his kids that freedom to go up the street over into the park. I mean, my oldest grandson has a cell phone with him, but they're outdoors as much as possible. And they're saying that 30 minutes a day outdoors is the minimum that our kids need. So the more time outdoors, the better. The more time away from screens, the better. Number two, set boundaries, time boundaries, and use a software program if needed. We need to teach our kids how to set boundaries. We do that by rewarding them and also disciplining them when they go overboard on this stuff. But we have to teach them how to self-manage, and that's ultimately our goal, where they'll set their boundaries themselves. But if you have a busy household, like I have one son and one daughter-in-law who have been working full-time out of their home, and they have two other wonderful boys who are my grandkids there. And so it can be tough in terms of keeping an eye on things. But, Kids Wi-Fi, Digital Covenant, DNS Web Filter, Disney Circle, there's all kinds of these software programs that you can get to control every device in your house that's connected to the internet. So if that would make your life easier, I wouldn't hesitate to get one of those. But at the same time, you're still monitoring, you're still encouraging them to exercise their own initiative in terms of time online and so forth and so on. Number three, don't protect your kids from pain and failure. They build character. One of the markers of this generation, and it'll be interesting to see if this changes, that we have a whole generation of what I call snowplow parents, and they're parents who want to go ahead of their kids like a snowplow through snow and push away anything that might bring pain or discomfort into the lives of their kids. And what happens when parents do that, you end up with a child who's underdeveloped mentally and socially because they just never had to deal with real life. Failure is just part of life. Failure builds resiliency, and kids will learn to cope with stress and anxiety. Now, we have to manage stress and anxiety. We don't want them to get completely stressed out, but a little bit of stress makes a person stronger. And we have forgotten that in our culture where everything is about comfort and not having anything bad happen to you. And part of the way you do that is to let your kids take responsibility for their own decisions. This book, Ready or Not, is one that I read this spring, and it's all about how to prepare your kids to cope with an ever-changing world and how to build their resiliency and how to develop coping skills. When I was a kid, way back when, I actually went to high school with Fred Flintstone. Didn't quite go back that far, but I can remember when I was about 12 years old, and I used to cut 10 lawns a week in my little town down near Chatham, Ontario. And I can remember a hot summer day like today, cutting the biggest lawn that I had was right across the street from my parents' house. It took me 2.5 hours to cut it with a push mower. And I can remember looking over, it's a hot, I'm dying of sweat. And I see my dad sitting on the front step, and he actually was having a beer. Now, maybe I shouldn't say that with a Christian audience, but he was having a beer. He had a beer a day. He lived to be over 100, so I don't think it hurt him. And I can remember thinking, if I can just go over and get my dad to come and help finish this lawn, that would be great for me. So I went over. Long story short, I pleaded, I cried, I begged, and my dad just looked at me and said, "You're the one who decided to cut 10 lawns a week. That's your responsibility. Have a glass of cold water, go back and finish the lawn. It's not going to kill you." And obviously it didn't. And I've never forgotten that moment. That was, 54 years ago. And that was a changing time, a changing point in my life where my dad taught me that you're responsible for whatever you take on. I'm not bailing you out. And there's just endless number of stories where my dad he just left me to deal with it. And that helped me to be a strong person and equip me for life. And and one of the skills we need to teach our kids is how to cope with these things when they come along. How do you cope with the pandemic? How do you cope with the pressures? And so we as parents have had a wonderful chance to do a lot of input in terms of life skills with our kids during the pandemic. Number four, make sure your kids, especially if they're stressed, get enough physical activity and cardio exercise. Now, we are living at a time where fear sells. So whatever is going on, it's like you'll swear this pandemic's never going to be over because there's bad news every day on the television. Doesn't matter what you hear, it's bad news. Well, bad news sells. Fear sells. That's why every headline is designed to strike fear into us. Well, there's only so much of that we can take, and especially for our kids who aren't equipped to deal with all this stuff. And the best thing your kids can do is to get out and get cardio exercise. Now, if you have a daughter, especially a teenage daughter, uh, you need to understand that the way girls cope with stress is quite different from boys. And a girl, when she gets stressed, tends to get stressed out, goes up very, very quickly. And that's because cortisol, which is a stress hormone, mixes with progesterone, which is a female chemical, and it's like throwing gasoline on a fire. About 10 years ago, I did a lot of reading and studying on the adolescent brain. And this is one of the things that I learned and I was fascinated by. So when a girl gets stressed out, she tends to stay stressed out for a longer period of time because of what's going on inside her body. And just when she starts to maybe come back to normal, and this could be 3 or 4 days out, she reads something else on her social media, which sends her back up here, and away it goes. We have 3 times as many girls in Canada who are suffering from stress and anxiety than there are boys. And so much of it relates back to the chemical composition that God has made their bodies up from. And so we need to understand that. One of the best things you can do for a girl who's stressed out is cardio activity. I have a daughter-in-law who taught kinesiology at the University of Laurier in Kitchener. And she used to go in and do cardio exercises in the middle of a 2-hour lecture. They give her 10 minutes to get everybody to stand up at their desk and get the heart going. And that is the best thing for all kids, but especially for our girls. Now, boys deal with stress a little bit differently. You'll see 2 boys playing road hockey. They're getting stressed out. They're getting angry. And how do they deal with their stress? They punch each other out, pick the sticks up, and go back to playing hockey. Theirs is like this. And so they deal with it quickly because they don't have the chemical in their bodies to deal with the way our girls do. So you need to be very understanding, and especially if you're doing ministry with girls, that this can really throw them off. So physical activity, cardio exercise, so important. Number 5, very important. Probably this is the best of them all. Model the kind of tech habits you expect of your children. And so if you want your kids to grow up to be responsible users of their screens, then that's what you need to be modeling for them. Here's some parents that I'd rather be on their screens than talking to their kids. I've been in, I don't know how many restaurants. I see this all the time. I think restaurants should ban screens of any type from coming in. And the reason is this, that for our kids, more is caught than taught. When my oldest son was 5 years old, we were painting. I had the real paint tray, real paint roller, paint brushes. He had the new paint tray, new paint roller, and invisible paint. And so he was painting one end of this wall, and I was painting the other end. And so we're painting and talking, and finally, my son said to me at 5 years old, "Dad, why do you tap your paint roller twice in the paint tray?" And I said, "I don't." He goes, "Yes, you do." I said, "No, I don't." I said, "Get back to painting." And so he's doing his invisible paint thing, and I roll my roller, and I just, without thinking, I roll it, and I tap it twice in my tray, and I did it, and I did it a second time. And I did that because in those days, 35 years ago, the refill wouldn't stay on the roller, and it would tend to move off the end. And it used to drive me crazy because I'm a perfectionist when I paint. And so what I would do is I would tap it twice, to make sure it was in perfect position. And when I put it up to the wall the second time, God said this to me. If he notices at 5 years old that you tap the paint roller twice, what's he going to see in your life the next 20 years until he's a young man? I still get a chill when I think of that. Why? Because more is caught than taught. The brain actually has what they call mimic neurons, and God has created us that way, that we learn by observation and then we mimic it, and that's what all of our kids do. And so when you're spending endless hours on your screen in front of your kids, they want to mimic your behavior because they want to be like you. That's why this whole issue of modeling is such an important thing. And maybe there's some changes that you need to make as mom and dad to curb that time and be a better example. I don't know. I just know that's an issue for most of us. I'm glad my kids are growing up and out of the house. Number 6. I got thinking about this one a couple of years ago. How about we tie 10% of our screen time to the building of the local kingdom? Now, I've got, all these flags here, and then we've got the Canadian flag, and we're great at serving in other countries and around the world. There's nothing wrong with that. But what if we took 10%? If you kept track for a week, how many hours you, your spouse, your kids spend on screens, and you took 10% of that and gave it to serving the local church, to serving the local community, to being out there and helping in some way, and being the servants that God has asked us to do, we would change our whole country. Because the way I look at it is that all the hours that we spend on screens, and I'm guessing most of them are pointless, that's time wasted. But if we do something for God and for the building of the kingdom, that's stuff that lasts for eternity. And so I would challenge you, if you have a family, is there some sort of a family project that you could give, 4 or 5 hours a week, or to serve in the church? Or one thing I did years ago, we adopted single parent families when I was doing direct ministry. And we had 4 or 5 single parent families that we took extra groceries to. We bought presents for the kids Christmas time and on their birthdays. The single moms knew they could call my YU office if they were short of money or they were having any particular issue. And that's what we did to kind of make our faith known as YU people. And the kids did most of this, or did all of this, in terms of caring for these people in our community. So there's just a ton of things that we can do. I'm always quoting this scripture to my grandchildren. Whatever you do, work to the best of your ability as unto the Lord. That's what we should be doing, is giving our time to the kingdom and doing it to the best of our abilities. Number 7, keep them off of smartphones as long as possible. There was an article online. Now, while I think of it, if you want a copy of my notes from tonight, which also have all of my slides attached to them, I'm happy to send you my notes. There'll be some other stuff coming up. My email is paul@paulrobertson.ca. It will come up on a screen, but if you want my notes or anything else, or I can help you in any way, please just let me know. So this article came out, can you raise a teen without a smartphone? And it's part of a website which is called Wait Until 8th, meaning 8th grade.com. And the lady who set this website up is encouraging all parents to keep screens away from their kids until 8th grade. Now, it's interesting, in Silicon Valley in California, where all the big shooters from Apple and Google and all these tech companies, the majority of their kids go to schools where computers aren't even introduced till grade 8. And what they're saying is that our kids don't need computers or screens until 8th grade at the earliest. What they need to learn is management skills, how to get along with others, how to communicate verbally, how to write, how to do all these other things. But anyway, with this lady, she put in a list, and this is just part of the list, what she found that she got from her daughter when she didn't get her phone until 8th grade. And these were the benefits that they found. And I think there's 8 of them. She never went to bed in tears because someone said something mean to her on social media. Never. She never woke up checking her phone to see how many likes she got before she could get dressed and proceed with her day. She never went to a therapist for social media depression and anxiety like so many of her friends. She was detached from the social drama, so when she walked through the door, she really came home. She didn't talk ugly about us, her parents, on social media. She didn't repost or share or like the latest gossip from school. She was never distracted by her phone during her homework, and she worked hard and did well in school. And the last one, I think this is the most important one. She talked to us about moral dilemmas and current issues instead of being shaped by the latest social media platform. And that's not even the whole list. Those are the benefits of keeping our kids away from screens. People ask me, how old should my kids be before they get their own phone? And I'm suggesting 25. Because at 25, that's when the brain is fully developed. But I mean, that's unrealistic. But I say keep them away as long as you possibly can. And I have a one-word answer. It's called pornography. If we know that there's a 99.9% chance that your kids are going to be exposed, either intentionally, but more than likely unintentionally, because porn stalks our children, why would we ever give a device to our kids that they can use when they're not in our presence? To me, that's the biggest danger of them all. But that's just the ranting of an old grandfather. So bear with me. All right. Number 8, very, very important. No one sleeps with a device of any type. I was just reading another research report that came out 2 years ago on the lack of sleep because so many of our kids are taking their devices to bed with them. But here's my suggestion. When your children go to bed, their devices go on the charger, which is in your bedroom. Make sure they put it on do not disturb or just turn it off completely so it's not going off in the middle of the night. And so everything at bedtime goes on the charger in the parents' bedroom. And the greatest advantage, there's 2 advantages. Number one, there won't be on their screens all night. Now, if you're the kind of parent who thinks, well, my kid would never be on their phone in the middle of the night, I would just say, think again about that one. But the most important value is this, and the most important benefit is this. When you wake your child up in the morning, they will jump out of bed and run to get their device. And you won't have to keep nagging them about getting them out of bed. It's the ultimate in alarm clock. But if they insist on having an alarm clock, you can get a little digital model like on that picture. You can go to Canadian Tire and for $20 you can get a digital clock if that's all they need. So don't let them use the excuse, I need my phone to use as an alarm clock. No, nothing attached to technology goes in the bedroom. It goes in the parents' bedroom. And they keep an eye on it until it's time to get up. I was at a Christian school a couple months ago, or back in February before pre-pandemic, and I was surprised. There were 95 kids in my presentation, grades 5 to 8, and I said, how many of you have your own phone? Not necessarily you bought it, but you have your own phone. You have access to your own phone. 94 out of 95 hands went up. The only hand that didn't go up was a little girl named Summer, and she was the only one, and she looked around, and I assured her, you will grow up perfectly normal without a phone. It can happen. It does happen. So don't be discouraged because you don't have a phone. Too many kids have phones. So no one sleeps with a device of any kind. Number 9. So there's my email address if you want a copy of this. Find ways to engage in more conversations. Now, I find a lot of parents and a lot of youth workers, for that matter, engaging in regular conversation seems to be more and more challenging as we spend more and more time on screens. I have a handout called 173 Conversation Starters. There's the first 5 on the top of the list. There's 168 more. I actually use this with my oldest grandson he calls out a number and I read him the question. And then he calls out a number and I read it, the question, and I answer it myself. They're the kind of questions just to keep things going, especially around the dinner table. So if you'd like a copy of that, just email me and I'll send that to you. And anything else I might be able to share with you, I'd be happy to get that to you. And you know, I think the best time to do some of this. Now, let me give you a couple of other things before I go on to the next slide. I also work with an organization down in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, called the Center for Parent Youth Understanding. And on that website, if you go on there, you'll see this thing called Family Table Talk. Excuse me while I have a sip of cold juice here. And if you go on there, you'll find all kinds of, they published or issued number 63 today. And so there's 63 in there. And what they look like is this. It's called Family Table Talk. They've had a number of youth pastors from around America write these and send them in. And we put them into PDF format. And they all tie back wherever possible to how we're coping with the pandemic. So it's a story, it's scripture, it's things you can pray about together, and they're all free on that website. Please go in and steal as much as you can. And there's tons of other stuff in there as well. Number 10, eat 5 or more meals together per week without screens. Is it the magic of the food? No, it's the magic of the conversation. All the research shows, and this has been repeated over and over again, that kids who have 5 or more meals together with their parents tend to, and let me read you one of the results from the University of Cincinnati. Children who do not eat with their parents 5 or more days a week have less trouble with drugs. In other words, well, let me rephrase it. 5 or more meals per week. Kids will have less trouble with drugs and alcohol. They'll eat healthier. They'll show better academic performance and report being closer with their parents than children who eat less often with their parents. And that includes things like drugs and alcohol as well. They just tend to turn out to be better kids because the time they're spending in communications and eating with the family. And if you look closely here on this picture, there's a mom and she's got the 173 discussion starters. And she's just asked a question to this young man. And obviously the rest of the family thinks his answer is pretty funny. So if you get that, you can use those as discussion starters as well. Number 11, encourage face-to-face relationships. Now, up until, the last couple of weeks, that's been pretty hard for our kids. And if they're still in positions where you have to go online, then at least use things like Zoom or Skype or Facebook Live, where it's a live interaction so they can read people's faces and hear the tone of voice and all those kinds of things. Because kids with better relational skills will tend to do better in life. And that's a skill that so many of our kids are losing because they're like these kids. They'd rather be on their screens and letting their thumb do the talking. But that doesn't work. When you go in for a job interview and the interviewer asks you a question, you can't text them back the answer. So we have to teach our kids to have these real face-to-face relationships. And at least with some of these live programs online, they're seeing that in real time. Number 12, help them to think Christianly and critically about culture and life. Our mission at CPYU is to help parents better understand today's culture and put it in a Christian context. And you get into all the issues. That website has every issue related to youth that you can think of. And it's all designed to put it in a Christian context. We've designed it for parents and youth workers so that whatever the issue that you're trying to resolve, we can be of some help to you in terms of putting it into a Christian context. And teaching our kids to think critically is so important. I mean, I'm hoping you've had some great theological discussions about the pandemic, about, how do you answer when they say, well, why has this happened? How can a loving God let this happen? That we have to, as parents and leaders, be thinking deeply about this stuff. The Anglican minister John Stott from England, and I actually had John Stott here in Toronto to speak many years ago. He died a couple of years ago. But in his book called The Contemporary Christian, he says this: every Christian needs two conversions, one out of the world to Christ, and a second back into the world with Christ. How do we take Christ back into the culture, into the pandemic? How do we teach our kids to think Christianly? Well, we've got some time on our hands where we can be doing this kind of stuff to equip our kids to grow up in the culture that they've inherited. 13, teach your kids to love reading and imaginative play. The greatest cure for boredom is when your kids come to you and say, we're bored, is for you to do nothing. Boredom will cure itself if you just give them time. Or you say something like, well, if you don't find something to do, I have a whole list of chores here I'd love you to do. Now, we need to provide them with some things: board games, puzzles, crafts, coloring books, construction paper, markers, whatever it might be. And a kid, because their brains are so creative, will tend to move to that. So don't just keep giving them screens all the time. I put on the bottom there that readers are leaders. If you have a child who doesn't love to read, they just haven't found the best book yet, because every kid likes to read. Kids learn to read by us reading to them. 3 of my grandsons, I formed reading clubs with them 2 months ago. I have one grandson, my oldest one, we're going through the Chronicles of Narnia. We do a chapter a day. We go online and FaceTime. And then I have 2 other ones that are a little bit younger. I'm reading a book on Minecraft, a novel, and another silly little book that my grandson just loves the humor. And so when I said to them, would you like to be in a reading club with Grandpa? They all jumped on it. And so we do it all on FaceTime. And my motivation is the bottom of that slide: readers are leaders. I want my kids to be readers. And you're hard pressed to find any leader in the world who wasn't an avid reader. They say John F. Kennedy, when he was president, read a book a day because he was a speed reader. And so finding the books that your grandkids would like to read. In fact, I've got one of them here. I'm reading with one of my grandsons. It's Timmy Failure, We Meet Again. It's volume number 4 or 5. And it is the funniest little book I have ever read. In fact, he's bringing me over another volume that he's read. And we read out loud together on FaceTime. And then I ask questions. Now, how would you describe Timmy's relationship with his mom in this chapter? And so there's a reason to my madness, but reading is a great option to screen time. In fact, I would go so far as to pay my kids to read. If they're not big readers, I would get them, because once they learn to love to read, they'll never turn back. Number 14, beware of strangers trying to make a connection. If you're a grown up, you know what I'm saying by that. And so I'm choosing my words carefully. But the bad guys are out big time. I was talking with a youth pastor in Kitchener a couple of weeks ago before we did a webinar for him, talking about how many of the girls in his youth group have been approached by inappropriate people wanting to make contact, and even his female adult mother volunteers. And they're just so blatant in what they're asking. It's like all the worms have come out of the wood. These guys and gals know there's no way that anybody's going to track them down, because it's so, it's just overwhelming during the pandemic, because they know more and more kids are online. Back in May 2020, 2 months ago, Cyber Tip Canada reported that reports of child exploitation have increased 40% since the pandemic started the second week of March. So moms and dads, keep an eye over their shoulder, teach them the right things to do when they're online, what they can share and can't share. Well, we don't have to be fearful, we just need to be smart. Last one, and then we'll do Q&A. Keep your phone on black and white, since your brain will find it boring. Now that's my phone, that's my home screen. and here's the reason why. There's my screen in color. It probably doesn't show up very well. but you know what a color screen is. Like what you need to understand is every color, when you go to a website or you're watching anything, every color is designed to keep your attention. Uh, Psychologists, sociologists, they've consulted the experts on what drives the brain, and color is one of the things that draws our brains or draws our eyes back to the screen. So if you put your phones on black and white, and I would challenge you to do this, if you're sitting there as a family and there's 5 smartphones in your home, I would challenge you tonight to put them all on black and white. Now, I only know how to put my iPhone 6 on by clicking that button 3 times and it turns it to black and white. But Google search it and see who can go the longest with leaving their phones on black and white. Your kids will spend less time looking at stuff. And again, if you had to give them some sort of financial incentive, I don't know if you can keep track of whether or not they switch to color. I did this with a college class at Emmanuel Bible College in Kitchener. And I taught them this, and 2 weeks later, when the class was over, one of the students came up to me and he said, "You know, Paul, that black and white thing, that grayscale thing works." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, when you told us that, there was a group of 10 of us got together here at the college. We all put our phones on black and white. And the last person to flip back to color, or the first person that switches back to color has to buy pizza for the rest of us." He said, "My screen time in 1 week has dropped an hour and a half because," he said, "black and white is so boring." I said, "Let me share something with you. Back in 1965, when I was 13 years old, television was black and white, photography was black and white, and morality was black and white. I don't know how these kids would have survived back in the days of black and white. But that's a very simple thing that you can do to to keep your eyes from being so attracted to it. The other thing, and I violated the principle, I would really encourage you never to have more than 6 icons on your home screen, and I'd bury them back in a folder someplace. And the further they're buried, the less likely you are to tap on them, use data, and waste time.